It was one of those nights where the rain just wouldn't quit. I was driving home along a deserted stretch of highway, the kind of road that feels endless, especially when the weather's as miserable as it was that evening. The windshield wipers were working overtime, swishing back and forth in a futile attempt to clear the thick sheets of rain. The headlights of my old sedan cut through the darkness, illuminating the slick asphalt ahead, but the storm made everything feel heavy and oppressive. I'm Harold Thompson, a middle-aged businessman who had just wrapped up another grueling day at the office. My mind was still buzzing with thoughts of reports to finalize and meetings to schedule. I could almost feel the fluorescent lights of my office still burning in my eyes, even though I was now surrounded by the dim glow of my car's interior. I sighed, wishing I could just get home, kick off my shoes, and forget about the day. As I navigated through the rain, I noticed how quiet it was. The only sound was the relentless patter of raindrops against the roof. It was almost peaceful, if it weren't for the fact that I was alone on this lonely stretch of road. Just as I was starting to zone out, I spotted something, or rather, someone, up ahead. A figure stood by the side of the road, drenched and shivering in the downpour. My heart skipped a beat. Who would be out here in this weather? I squinted through the rain and caught a glimpse of a young woman in tattered clothing. She looked like she could use some help. I hesitated for a moment, my instincts battling with the fear of picking up a stranger. But then I thought about how I'd want someone to stop for me if I were in her shoes. I slowed down and rolled down the window, the rain pouring in and soaking the seat. Need a ride? I called out, trying to keep my voice steady despite the unease creeping in. She stepped closer, her face pale and her eyes wide with desperation. Yes, please. I need to get to the cemetery, she said, her voice barely audible over the rain. The request struck me as odd. A cemetery? At this hour? But the urgency in her voice left little room for hesitation. All right, hop in, I replied, trying to sound casual. She climbed into the back seat, dripping water all over my upholstery. I glanced at her in the rearview mirror, catching a glimpse of her sad, forlorn expression. What's your name? I asked, hoping to break the ice. Jessica, she replied, her voice trembling slightly. Thank you for stopping. I didn't think anyone would. No problem, Jessica. Just hang tight, we'll be there soon, I said, trying to reassure her as I focused on the road ahead. The drive was mostly silent, punctuated only by the sound of the rain and the occasional rumble of thunder. I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. Why was she out here alone? Why the cemetery? But I pushed those thoughts aside, reminding myself that everyone has their reasons. After what felt like an eternity, I finally saw the dim lights of the cemetery entrance. The wrought iron gate loomed ahead, partially obscured by overgrown vines. I slowed down, my heart racing a bit as I approached. We're almost there, I said, glancing in the rearview mirror again. To my shock, the back seat was empty. Jessica had vanished. My heart dropped, and I felt a cold sweat break out on my brow. I pulled over to the side of the road, my mind racing. Had I imagined her? Was I just exhausted from work? I stepped out of the car, the rain soaking me instantly. Hello? I called out, my voice swallowed by the storm. There was no answer, just the sound of rain hitting the pavement and the distant rumble of thunder. Panic set in as I stumbled back to my car, frantically searching the area. There was no sign of her anywhere. The cemetery stood ominously in the darkness, its ancient tombstones standing like silent sentinels. I felt a chill run down my spine. What just happened? Was I losing my mind? As I drove away, I couldn't shake the eerie feeling that had settled in my gut. Had I really picked up a hitchhiker? Or was it all a figment of my imagination? I tried to convince myself that I was just tired, but a deep-seated fear took root. I couldn't stop thinking about Jessica and the strange request to go to the cemetery. The next morning, I still felt shaken. I recounted the events to my coworkers, but their skepticism only fueled my unease. "You probably just saw a shadow or something, Harold," one of them said dismissively. But I knew what I had experienced. Determined to find answers, I decided to visit the local library, hoping to uncover any information about the cemetery or the woman I had picked up. The library was a quiet sanctuary, filled with the musty scent of old books. I spent hours sifting through records and newspapers from the past decades. My heart raced when I stumbled upon an old article about a tragic car accident that had occurred years ago. The article detailed the story of a young woman who had died in a crash on that very highway. As I read, my hands trembled. The description matched Jessica perfectly, down to her tattered clothing. The article mentioned that she had been heading to the cemetery when her car skidded off the road during a storm, just like the one I had driven through that night. The realization hit me like a jolt. I had given a ride to a ghost. The days that followed were marked by an unsettling fear. I found myself avoiding night drives, dreading the dark roads that might lead me back to that moment. My once routine commutes became fraught with anxiety, and I started noticing small, eerie details I had previously ignored. The shadows seemed darker, the night more oppressive. My colleagues noticed the change in me, my distracted demeanor and the pallor of my skin. Conversations about mundane matters would cause me to flinch, my mind always drifting back to that fateful night. I was haunted by vivid dreams of the stormy highway and the ghostly woman. One evening, I met up with an old friend who was a paranormal enthusiast. Desperate for answers and seeking some form of validation, I recounted my experience in detail. He listened intently, nodding as I spoke. "You're not alone in this," he said reassuringly. "The vanishing hitchhiker is a common urban legend. It's said that these spirits are bound to repeat their final journey, seeking resolution or simply reliving their last moments." His words provided little comfort. My encounter felt too real, and the fear of the supernatural had embedded itself deep within me. I couldn't shake the feeling that Jessica's ghost might be trapped in a loop, forever trying to reach her destination, unable to find peace. As the months passed, my dread faded into a more manageable fear. I avoided driving at night as much as possible, opting for safer, more predictable routines. The highway remained a haunting reminder of that stormy night, a tangible symbol of my brush with the unknown. In time, I came to terms with my experience. I accepted it as a part of my life, a strange but undeniable encounter with the supernatural. While I never found definitive answers, I found solace in understanding that the experience had profoundly changed me. I became more aware of the fragile boundary between reality and the unknown. The story of the vanishing hitchhiker left an indelible mark on my life, a reminder of the thin veil that separates the living from the spectral echoes of the past. My nights were still tinged with unease, but I learned to embrace the fear as a reminder of the mysteries that lay beyond understanding. The highway, with its secrets and shadows, remained a testament to my encounter with the extraordinary, forever etched in my memory. I'll never forget that night in the summer of 1958, when my family and I found ourselves at a rundown diner that turned out to be the stuff of nightmares. We were on a cross-country road trip, looking for a place to grab a bite to eat before hitting the road again. Little did we know, we were about to step into a horror story that would haunt us forever. The diner was a relic from a bygone era. The neon sign that once proudly advertised best burgers in town now flickered sporadically, struggling to stay lit. The paint was peeling off the walls, and the windows were so grimy it was hard to tell if they were dirty or just perpetually fogged up. Inside, the atmosphere was just as bleak. The linoleum floor was cracked and stained, and the few tables that were still standing had mismatched chairs. When we walked in, the bell above the door jingled, and a shiver ran down my spine. It was like stepping into a forgotten time. The owner, a tall, gaunt man with a scraggly beard and dark, hollow eyes, greeted us with a forced smile. He was wearing a stained white apron that looked like it hadn't been washed in decades. "Evening," he said in a voice that sounded like it hadn't been used much. "Sit wherever you like." We chose a booth in the back, hoping to avoid the gaze of other patrons. The few people who were there were hunched over their plates, eating in silence. The air was thick with the smell of something unpleasant, an odd mix of rancid meat and stale grease. After we sat down, the owner shuffled over and handed us a menu. It was covered in grease and had a few pages missing. "We're famous for our meatloaf and burgers," he said. "What'll it be?" We ordered a mix of burgers and meatloaf, hoping for a quick meal so we could get back on the road. The food took longer to arrive than expected, and when it finally did, it was served on chipped, mismatched plates. The meatloaf was grayish and unappetizing, and the burgers looked like they'd been sitting out for hours. But we were tired and hungry, so we dug in. The first bite was a mistake. The meat tasted strange, bitter and off. I tried to convince myself it was just my imagination, but when I saw the look on my wife's face, I knew something was wrong. Our little boy took one bite and immediately started to look pale. I glanced at my wife, who was trying to hide her disgust, but it was clear she was feeling ill. "Maybe it's just the grease," I said, trying to reassure her. "It's probably nothing." But as we continued eating, our discomfort grew. My stomach churned, and I could see my wife's face turning green. Our son, who was usually energetic, was now slumped over in his seat, looking like he was about to be sick. That's when the owner came over, his eyes glinting with something I couldn't quite place. "How's everything?" he asked, his voice oozing insincerity. "Actually, we're not feeling so great," I admitted. "The food tastes a little strange." The owner's smile widened, but it didn't reach his eyes. "Oh, I'm sorry to hear that. Let me get you something else." He disappeared into the kitchen, and I felt a wave of unease. My wife was now clutching her stomach, and our son was moaning quietly. It wasn't long before the owner returned with a new round of food. "Here you go." on the house. We hesitated, but our hunger and fatigue won out. We ate the new dishes, but the taste was even worse. I couldn't shake the feeling that something was terribly wrong. My wife was now shaking and sweating, and our son had gone quiet. I paid for the meal, and we tried to leave, but when I went outside, I realized with a sinking feeling that our car wouldn't start. The engine turned over but sputtered and died. Panic began to set in. "Great," I muttered. Of course this would happen now. I went back inside to use the phone, but the owner was blocking the door. "I'm afraid the phone lines are down," he said, his tone suddenly cold. "You're welcome to stay until morning." "No thanks," I said, trying to keep calm. "We need to get going." He just smiled that same unsettling smile. "I insist." Feeling trapped, I turned to my family, and we huddled in a corner of the diner, trying to figure out what to do next. That's when we heard it, a loud, grinding noise coming from the kitchen. The clatter of metal and the smell of something foul filled the air. I looked at my wife, who was now trembling uncontrollably. "We need to get out of here," I said, grabbing her hand. The owner appeared again, but this time he was holding a meat cleaver, his face twisted into a maniacal grin. "Looks like you're not leaving just yet," he said, his voice dripping with malice. My heart raced as we backed away from him. "What the hell is going on?" I shouted, panic rising. He laughed, a chilling, echoing sound that seemed to fill the room. "You didn't really think you'd get away with that, did you?" Before I could react, he lunged at us with the cleaver. We scrambled to dodge his attacks, the blade slicing through the air with a deadly whoosh. My wife screamed as she ducked behind a table, pulling our son with her. I grabbed a nearby chair and swung it at the owner, trying to keep him at bay. The struggle was chaotic and terrifying. We managed to push the owner back for a moment, but he kept coming, his eyes burning with a crazed intensity. I could see the gleam of the cleaver as it swung dangerously close. In the chaos, I spotted an exit sign near the back of the diner. "This way!" I yelled, grabbing my family and running toward the door. We pushed through, stumbling into the cool night air. I didn't look back as we dashed for our car, praying it would start. Miraculously, the engine roared to life on the first try. We sped away from the diner, the headlights cutting through the darkness. I could see the diner in the rearview mirror, a dark, looming silhouette against the desert sky. I kept driving, not stopping until we were miles away. Eventually, we found a motel and spent the rest of the night in a safe, albeit uncomfortable, room. The next morning, we reported the incident to the police. They went back to the diner, but when they arrived, they found it abandoned and covered in dust. No sign of the owner or any evidence of the night's horrors. It was like the diner had been closed up and forgotten for years. To this day, I can't explain what we saw that night. It's as if the diner had been a twisted nightmare, and the owner was a figment of our collective fear. We never went back, and I often wonder if it was all just a bad dream. But every now and then, I catch myself looking over my shoulder, half expecting to see the flickering neon sign and the ghostly owner waiting in the darkness. So, if you ever find yourself on a deserted road and spot a rundown diner with a flickering sign, think twice before stopping. Sometimes, the horrors we encounter are more real than we'd like to believe. I used to think working the night shift at a remote truck stop in the desert would be a boring job, just endless hours of waiting and cleaning. But that all changed one night in the 1990s. That night turned out to be something out of a nightmare. It was one of those pitch-black desert nights when you can barely see your hand in front of your face. The truck stop was isolated, with nothing but endless stretches of sand and the occasional tumbleweed to break up the monotony. I was 22 and had taken a night shift at the truck stop to make some extra cash for college. The place was usually quiet, with just the hum of the fluorescent lights and the occasional rumble of a truck pulling in or out. That night started off like any other. I was doing my rounds, making sure everything was stocked and cleaned. I had just finished mopping the floor in the men's room when I noticed something odd. There, lying on the sink, was a bloodied knife. I felt a chill run down my spine. My first thought was that it must have been some kind of prank, but as I picked it up with a paper towel, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was seriously wrong. I turned to check the stalls and realized the trucker who had been in there moments before was nowhere to be found. He had been a burly guy with a scruffy beard and a heavy-set frame, nothing that would normally raise alarms. But tonight, something about him had felt off, like he was hiding something. I put the knife back down and tried to calm myself. "It's probably just someone messing around," I muttered, trying to convince myself. But as I walked out of the men's room, I couldn't ignore the sinking feeling in my stomach. I made my way back to the counter, but my nerves were on edge. I kept glancing at the clock in the dark windows, waiting for the next customer to come in. When the bell above the door jingled, I looked up, expecting to see a new trucker or maybe a late-night traveler. Instead, it was the same trucker who had been in the men's room earlier. He gave me a crooked smile that didn't reach his eyes. "Everything okay?" he asked, his voice gruff. "Yeah," I replied, trying to sound casual. "Just the usual." "You need anything?" He shook his head and walked over to the coffee machine. I watched him pour himself a cup, trying to ignore the gnawing feeling that he was somehow involved with the knife. The rest of the night was a blur of shifting unease. I kept checking the men's room, but the knife was gone. The trucker was still there, and every now and then, I'd catch him watching me from the corner of his eye. His presence was unnerving, and I felt like I was being watched even when he wasn't around. Hours dragged by, and my only company was the occasional trucker and the ceaseless wind outside. Around 3 a.m., the trucker who had been so strange earlier finally left. He walked out of the truck stop with a purposeful stride, disappearing into the darkness. I felt a fleeting sense of relief, but it was quickly overshadowed by the nagging thought that something terrible was about to happen. Not long after he left, the truck stop was eerily quiet. I went back to my routine, trying to shake the paranoia that had settled over me. Just as I was starting to think the worst was over, I heard a noise from the men's room. It sounded like someone was moving around. My heart raced as I approached the door, pushing it open slowly. What I saw inside made my blood run cold. The men's room was empty, but there was a trail of fresh blood leading toward the back exit. My mind raced, trying to piece together what I had seen and heard. I knew I needed to leave and call the police, but my feet felt like they were glued to the floor. As I turned to head back to the front counter, the sound of tires crunching on gravel made me freeze. I looked out the window and saw the trucker's rig parked outside. He was back, and he was heading toward the truck stop. My heart pounded in my chest. I realized then that he hadn't just left, he had been waiting for the right moment. I dashed to the back office and grabbed the phone, but just as I was about to dial 911, the lights flickered and went out. The whole place was plunged into darkness. I could hear the trucker's footsteps approaching, heavy and deliberate. I took a deep breath and bolted out the back door, hoping to find safety in the desert night. The cold air hit me like a slap, and I stumbled through the sand, my flashlight swinging wildly. I could hear the trucker's voice calling out, but I didn't dare look back. The desert was vast and unwelcoming, and I had no idea where I was going, but I had to keep moving. I could hear the trucker getting closer, his footsteps crunching behind me. I ran as fast as I could, dodging cacti and rocks. My breaths came in ragged gasps, and I felt like my legs were going to give out any second. Every shadow seemed to hold a new threat, and the desert wind howled like a banshee. Just when I thought I couldn't run any further, I saw headlights cutting through the darkness. I waved frantically, hoping against hope that someone would see me. A car came speeding toward me, and I stumbled into its path, nearly collapsing from exhaustion. The driver, a middle-aged man with a worried expression, pulled over and helped me into the car. I told him everything, my voice shaking with fear. He called the police and drove us to a nearby safe house, where I was able to get medical attention and wait for the authorities. When the police arrived at the truck stop, they found the place empty. The trucker's rig was gone, and there was no sign of him or any evidence of the horrors I had witnessed. The authorities searched the area, but they never found him. The whole experience left me shaken and traumatized. I tried to go back to my normal life, but the fear of that night lingered. I had nightmares about the trucker and the bloodied knife, and I couldn't shake the feeling that I was still being watched. Every time I heard a truck engine in the distance, my heart would skip a beat. I ended up leaving the truck stop job shortly after that night, unable to cope with the lingering anxiety. I moved to a different town, hoping to leave the past behind. But no matter where I went, the memory of the trucker and the terror of that night stayed with me. If you ever find yourself in a remote truck stop or some isolated place, remember my story. Sometimes, the most mundane places can hide the darkest secrets. And sometimes, the monsters we fear are all too real. I still remember the night we decided to explore the old asylum on the outskirts of town. It was the 1970s, and we were a bunch of college students craving thrills. We had heard countless stories about the place, but nothing prepared us for what we would find. The asylum had been abandoned for decades. It was a crumbling, decrepit structure with boarded-up windows and a sign that was barely legible. The stories about it were as varied as they were chilling, everything from tortured souls trapped in the walls to bizarre experiments performed by long-gone doctors. It was a crisp autumn evening when we piled into my friend Mike's old van. There were 5 of us: Mike, Rachel, Tom, Sarah, and me. We were all buzzing with a mix of excitement and nerves. I remember Rachel, the most skeptical of us, saying, "I bet it's just a bunch of rats and old furniture. Nothing to be scared of." Mike parked the van in a gravel lot beside the asylum, and we all climbed out, our breath fogging in the cool air. The building loomed in front of us, its dark, broken windows resembling empty eye sockets. We grabbed our flashlights and made our way toward the main entrance. the front door creaked open, revealing a dark, musty hallway. The air inside was stale, and the floor was littered with debris. "Let's split up," Mike suggested. "We'll cover more ground that way." Against my better judgment, I agreed. We each took a different hallway, our footsteps echoing off the decaying walls. As I walked, the light from my flashlight danced across faded, peeling wallpaper and old, rusted medical equipment. I tried to shake off the unease that was settling in my stomach. "It's just an old building," I told myself. I turned a corner and found myself in what had once been a patient's room. The bed was still there, its metal frame covered in grime. There were old, yellowed papers scattered across the floor. I picked one up, squinting to read the faded text. It was a patient's record, but the details were illegible. A sudden noise made me jump. It sounded like a low, guttural growl. I shone my flashlight toward the sound, but all I saw were shadows playing tricks on my eyes. "Probably just the building settling," I muttered, trying to sound convincing. I walked deeper into the asylum, my flashlight revealing more disturbing sights. Old, broken furniture, rusty wheelchairs, and abandoned personal items filled the rooms. The sense of decay and neglect was overwhelming. Every now and then, I'd hear something, a soft thud, a whisper, but when I turned around, there was nothing there. After what felt like an eternity, I decided to check in with the others. "Hey, Mike. Rachel. Tom. Sarah." I called out, but my voice only echoed back at me. I began to feel a gnawing sense of dread. What if they'd gotten lost? I tried calling again, but there was no response. I decided to head back toward the main hall, where we'd agreed to meet if we got separated. As I made my way back, I noticed something strange. The layout of the asylum seemed different, like the hallways had shifted. I shook my head, blaming it on my growing anxiety. When I finally reached the main hall, I saw Mike and Rachel standing by the entrance to the basement, looking concerned. "Have you seen Tom and Sarah?" Mike asked. "No," I replied. "I haven't been able to find them. I thought we were supposed to meet here." Rachel's face was pale. I heard some really weird noises, like someone was whispering or crying. It was coming from the basement. Mike frowned. "Let's check it out. They might be down there." We descended into the basement, the steps groaning under our weight. The basement was even more decrepit than the upper floors. Our flashlights flickered in the darkness, revealing old, rotting furniture and strange stains on the floor. A musty, damp smell filled the air. As we explored, we started hearing faint noises, muffled cries and shuffling sounds. My heart pounded in my chest. "Guys, this place is seriously freaking me out," I said, my voice trembling. We continued searching, our anxiety growing with each passing minute. Suddenly, Tom's voice echoed through the darkness. "Help! Over here!" We followed the sound, our footsteps quickening. When we turned a corner, we were met with a horrifying sight. Tom and Sarah's bodies were sprawled on the floor, their faces twisted in terror. Their clothes were torn, and there were gruesome wounds on their bodies. It looked like something, or someone, had brutally attacked them. Rachel screamed, and Mike's face went ashen. "We need to get out of here," he shouted. We turned to leave, but the asylum seemed to come alive around us. Shadows moved and shifted, blocking our path. An oppressive presence seemed to envelop us. The walls seemed to close in, and the air grew colder. Then, we saw it. A ghostly figure emerged from the shadows, a translucent, menacing presence with hollow eyes and a grotesque smile. It advanced toward us, its movements jerky and unnatural. We tried to run, but the figure seemed to follow us wherever we went. In a panic, we stumbled through the asylum, desperately searching for an exit. The building felt like it was actively working against us, with hallways and doors shifting in impossible ways. Our flashlights flickered, and we were plunged into darkness multiple times. We could hear the sinister laughter of the ghostly figure behind us. Finally, we burst through a door and found ourselves back in the main hall. We scrambled up the stairs, our breath coming in ragged gasps. As we reached the entrance, we realized that the door was jammed. Mike tried to force it open, but it wouldn't budge. Just when we thought we were doomed, the door creaked open, and we stumbled out into the cold night air. We didn't stop running until we were safely back at the van. Our clothes were dirty, and our faces were pale with fear. As we drove away, we glanced back at the asylum, its dark silhouette looming ominously in the distance. I could see the relief on everyone's faces, but there was also a shared understanding that we had narrowly escaped something truly evil. In the weeks that followed, none of us could shake the experience. We tried to talk about it, but it was clear that the trauma had taken a toll. Mike eventually stopped talking about the asylum altogether, and Rachel moved away, unable to handle the constant nightmares. Tom and Sarah's families were devastated by their loss, and their tragic end only deepened the haunting memories of that night. I was the only one who tried to make sense of what happened. I visited a few historians and paranormal experts, but no one could provide clear answers. The asylum was reportedly demolished shortly after our visit, but I doubt that would have made a difference. Whatever we encountered that night seemed tied to the building itself. I still have nightmares about that place, about the shadows that seemed to watch us, the ghostly figure that pursued us, and the screams of our friends. Sometimes, I'll be lying in bed, and I'll hear the faintest sound of laughter echoing through my dreams. It's a chilling reminder that some places are better left undisturbed. So if you ever hear someone talking about that old asylum or think about exploring an abandoned place just for the thrill of it, remember my story. Sometimes, curiosity can lead you to things that are better left alone. And some experiences, no matter how thrilling they might seem, are far too real and terrifying to ever forget. It's funny how a simple trip can turn into a nightmare. I remember it like it was yesterday, even though it was back in the 1990s. My family and I had just wrapped up a long drive, heading home after visiting some relatives. We were tired, the kids were cranky, and we just wanted to get home. But that day, a detour led us to something that still gives me chills. We were driving through a small town when my husband spotted a garage sale. He suggested we stop for a break. At first, I wasn't thrilled about the idea. But the kids were excited, so we pulled over. The garage sale was one of those old-fashioned setups with tables covered in all sorts of odds and ends. We were just about to head back to the car when my daughter, Emily, who was about 6 at the time, ran up to me with a creepy-looking clown doll. "Mom, look at this," she exclaimed, her eyes wide with excitement. The doll was the kind you'd expect to see in a horror movie, clown face painted in garish colors, with a ruffled collar and the creepiest smile. I wasn't too keen on it, but she seemed so thrilled that I couldn't bring myself to say no. The seller was an older woman, and she was more than happy to part with the doll for a couple of bucks. "Oh, that old thing? I'm glad to see it go," she said with a chuckle. I didn't think much of it at the time. We packed the doll away in the back of the car and continued on our way. The kids were overjoyed with their new toy, and it kept them occupied during the drive. We finally got home, and after a long day, we all crashed into our beds. That's when things started to get weird. Around midnight, I was jolted awake by a strange sound. It was a high-pitched, eerie laughter, like a twisted version of what you'd hear at a circus. I shook my husband awake. "Do you hear that?" I asked, my voice trembling. He groaned and rubbed his eyes. "It's probably just the kids," he said, though I could tell he was unsettled too. We listened closely and realized the laughter was coming from the kids' room. We tiptoed down the hall, the floorboards creaking under our feet. As we approached, the laughter grew louder, and we could hear the faint sound of something moving around. When we finally opened the door, I could hardly believe what I saw. The clown doll was sitting on the edge of the bed, its head tilted in an unnatural way. The laughter was coming from it, and it seemed to grow louder and more distorted by the second. My heart raced as I tried to make sense of it. "What the hell?" my husband muttered, stepping into the room. He grabbed the doll, intending to throw it away, but as soon as he touched it, the laughter stopped abruptly. The next few days were a blur of increasing tension. The doll's behavior escalated from strange to downright sinister. It would appear in different places around the house, always with that unnerving grin. Sometimes it would be on the living room couch, other times in the hallway, as if it were watching us. One night, we were all sitting in the living room, trying to relax after dinner, when we heard a loud crash from upstairs. My husband and I exchanged worried glances and rushed upstairs to find the doll sprawled on the floor of the kids' room. It looked like it had been thrown against the wall. The kids were asleep, blissfully unaware of the horror the doll was causing. We tried to calm ourselves and chalked it up to the doll being a bit too old and stiff. But deep down, we knew something was seriously wrong. That night, the doll's laughter returned, but this time it was accompanied by strange, creaking noises. We decided to lock the doll in the attic, hoping to put an end to the disturbances. I climbed up to the attic and placed the doll on a shelf, away from anything else. As I turned to leave, I could have sworn I heard a soft, mocking laugh. Over the next few days, things only got worse. The laughter grew more frequent and the doll's movements more erratic. It felt like the doll was actively trying to scare us. Every time we checked on it, its grin seemed to widen, and its eyes seemed to follow us around. One night, we were woken by a loud, violent thump coming from the attic. We knew we had to do something. I couldn't bear to see my family live in constant fear, so I told my husband we needed to get rid of the doll once and for all. We decided to take it to the local dump the next morning and be done with it. The next day, we packed up the doll and drove to the dump. The sky was overcast, and a cold wind blew as we approached the large pile of refuse. My husband grabbed the doll, ready to toss it into the pit. As he did, The doll's eyes seemed to flare with a sinister light, and its mouth twisted into a grotesque snarl. In a moment of horrifying clarity, we both realized we were not dealing with just a creepy old toy. This was something else entirely. My husband hesitated, then threw the doll into the pit. The instant it hit the ground, there was a loud, shattering noise. We didn't stick around to see what happened next. We got back into the car, shaken but relieved that it was finally over. When we got home, we were both drained. The whole experience had left us on edge. To ensure nothing like this would ever happen again, we decided to donate all of our children's toys to charity. The idea of having anything related to that doll in our house was simply too terrifying. In the months that followed, life slowly returned to normal. The laughter stopped, and the oppressive atmosphere that had settled over our house lifted. However, the memory of that doll haunted us. We tried to go back to our routines, but the fear lingered. Sometimes, I find myself wondering if it was all just a figment of our imagination or if there really was something supernatural about that doll. All I know is that the experience changed us. We learned to be more cautious about the things we bring into our home and to trust our instincts. Every now and then, when I hear a strange noise or see a doll in a store, I can't help but shiver. The memory of that night is a reminder that some things are better left untouched, and that sometimes, the most innocent-looking objects can hide the darkest secrets. So, if you ever find yourself at a garage sale and spot a clown doll with a grin that seems a bit too wide, maybe think twice before bringing it home. Trust me, you don't want to end up with a reminder of what happened to us. I woke with a start, my heart pounding against my ribs. The musty air of the motel room felt heavy in my lungs. The flickering lamp beside the bed cast eerie, distorted shadows across the peeling wallpaper. A cold draft swept through the room, making the old, rattling window groan as if protesting the chill. I rubbed my eyes and glanced towards the window, which was ajar and rattling with each gust of wind. As I shuffled to close it, a movement caught my eye. A shadowy figure lurked just beyond the dim light's reach. My breath hitched, and my pulse quickened as I blinked, and it vanished. "Mate, wake up!" I whispered urgently, shaking my partner, Jess. She groaned, her face buried in the pillow. "What's up?" she mumbled, barely awake. There was something in the corner. "I saw a shadow," I said, my voice trembling with a mix of fear and disbelief. Jess sat up, her eyes still clouded with sleep. "You're just imagining things," she said, trying to sound reassuring. "It's probably just the shadows playing tricks." But I couldn't shake the feeling of dread settling over me. My mind drifted back to the old newspaper article I'd glimpsed in the lobby earlier, a story about a mass murder that had taken place at this very motel years ago. At the time, I dismissed it as a ghost story meant to scare tourists, but now, it felt disturbingly real. As the first light of dawn seeped into the room, we decided it was time to leave. I grabbed the rusty key with the number 13 engraved on it and headed for the door. When I turned the knob, it wouldn't budge. Panic surged through me as I twisted and pulled, but it was stuck fast. "Let me have a go," Jess said, her voice rising in pitch as anxiety crept into her tone. We both pushed against the door, but it remained stubbornly shut. That's when we heard it, a low, guttural sound, like a whispering wind, seemed to emanate from the walls. The sound grew louder, and I felt a chill race down my spine. "Get away from there," a voice hissed, echoing in the room like a menacing whisper from the shadows. I stumbled back, my heart racing so fast I thought it might burst. "What was that?" I asked, my voice barely a whisper. "I don't know," Jess screamed, her eyes darting around the room, her face as pale as the walls. In a frenzy, I turned to the window, but it was locked tight. The air felt charged, electric, and I could sense the spirits drawing closer, their presence suffocating. The room seemed to close in on us, the walls pressing inward with an almost tangible weight of despair. Finally, with a desperate shove, I managed to pry the door open, and we bolted down the dimly lit hallway, our hearts pounding in our chests like drumbeats of terror. We reached the front desk, but the owner, Barry, was nowhere to be found. The lobby was eerily silent, the stillness hanging heavily in the air. "Where is he?" Jess asked, her voice shaky as she peered around. "I don't know." "We need to get out of here," I said, casting a nervous glance back at the dark hallway. We rushed outside, but as I reached for the car door, a sickening realization struck me: the engine wouldn't start. The car sputtered and died, leaving us stranded with no way to escape. "Are you kidding me?" Jess cried, her voice rising in panic. Her eyes were wide with fear, and her breaths came in quick, shallow gasps. I felt a cold sweat break out on my forehead as the oppressive atmosphere of the motel seemed to press down on us. "We have to run," I shouted, grabbing her hand tightly. My mind raced, trying to process the surreal nightmare we were caught in. We sprinted down the deserted road, the motel receding into the distance behind us. My legs burned with exertion, and my breath came in ragged gasps. As we reached the next petrol station, I collapsed against the wall, trying to steady my racing heartbeat. "We made it," I managed to say, though the tremor in my voice betrayed my lingering fear. The relief was fleeting. The memory of the motel haunted me, the shadows and whispers lingering like a dark cloud over my thoughts. I glanced at Jess, who looked just as shaken, her eyes reflecting the same fear that gnawed at me. "I don't think I'll ever be able to stay in another motel again," she said, her voice trembling, and she clutched my arm as if afraid to let go. "Me neither," I replied, my heart heavy with the weight of what we had experienced. In the days that followed, I found myself replaying the events over and over, trying to make sense of what had happened. The fear had changed us, deepening the cracks in our relationship. We had come to the motel seeking a quiet escape, but instead, we had confronted our worst nightmares. The experience left us both on edge, our minds plagued by lingering fear. Every creak of the floorboards, every flicker of the lights sent us spiraling back to that night. I found myself jumping at shadows, and Jess would often wake up screaming, haunted by visions of the motel. Our once peaceful home now felt like a haunted echo of the terror we had escaped. One night, as we lay in bed, I turned to her, my voice barely above a whisper. "Do you think it was real?" I asked, my mind grappling with the haunting memories. "What do you mean?" she asked, her brow furrowing as she turned to face me. The shadows, the whispers, it felt so real. But maybe it was just our minds playing tricks on us. Jess sighed, running a hand through her hair in a gesture of frustration and worry. "I don't know. But whatever it was, it felt like it was trying to tell us something." That thought lingered in my mind, refusing to be dismissed. What if the spirits were trying to communicate? What if they were trapped, just like we had felt? I couldn't shake the feeling that we had stumbled into something far more significant than just a haunted motel. A week later, driven by an unsettling sense of unfinished business, we decided to go back. I know it sounds crazy, but I felt compelled to confront whatever had happened. I needed closure, and I hoped Jess would feel the same. As we drove back, the familiar landscape of the highway stretched out before us, but this time, it felt different. The air was thick with anticipation, and I could feel my heart racing with a mix of dread and determination. When we arrived at the Twilight Inn, the sun hung low in the sky, casting long, eerie shadows across the cracked asphalt. The neon sign flickered weakly, just as it had before. I took a deep breath and parked the car, trying to steady my nerves. "Are you sure about this?" Jess asked, her voice tinged with apprehension. She looked at me with a mixture of fear and resolve. "I have to know," I replied, trying to sound more confident than I felt. The weight of our previous encounter pressed heavily on my shoulders. We entered the lobby, and Barry was there, leaning against the counter with a knowing smile that sent a shiver down my spine. "Back again, I see. Room 13 still available, just for you two." "Thanks, but we're here to talk," I said, trying to keep my voice steady despite the uneasy gnawing in my stomach. Barry raised an eyebrow, a glint of something unreadable in his eyes. "Talk? About what?" "About what happened last time we were here. The noises, the shadows." He chuckled, a sound that sent chills running down my spine. "Old buildings have their quirks, you know. Just the wiring, probably." I exchanged a worried glance with Jess, who looked just as uneasy. "We want to know about the history of this place," I pressed, my voice tinged with desperation. Barry's smile faded slightly, and his eyes grew dark. "History can be a tricky thing. It's best left buried." "Why?" Jess asked, her voice firm despite the tremor in it. "What happened here?" Barry hesitated, his gaze dropping to the floor. "There was a family once, years ago. They were troubled. The father snapped one night. It wasn't pretty. They say the spirits still linger here, trapped in a cycle of pain." A shiver ran down my spine as I processed his words. "Why didn't you tell us this before?" "Some things are better left unsaid," he replied, his voice barely above a whisper, his eyes darkening with a strange intensity. We took the key and headed back to room 13, the weight of Barry's words heavy in the air. As we stepped inside, the familiar mustiness hit us, but this time, it felt different, charged with a sense of purpose. "Let's try to communicate," I suggested, pulling out my phone. "We can record our voices, maybe ask if anyone is there." Jess nodded, her expression serious as she helped me set up the phone on the dresser. We began to speak into the silence, our voices trembling with the weight of our mission. "Is anyone here with us?" I asked, my voice quivering. "If you can hear us, please make a sound." For a moment, there was nothing but silence. Then, faint,